Weymouth is very special, not just because it's my town and I'm the mayor, but it really, really is a special community. We were named the 52nd best town to raise a family and to live in, and that's across the nation. In a time with economic strain, we're still even able to hold on. So when you get residents who really, really care for their town, they're very special, they're folksy, they're families, it's all about real families. It's how your community takes those struggles, deals with it, and keeps going on. It's pride in community. It's a sort of spirit. Weymouth has a spirit that I don't see everywhere. We address our problems, and we celebrate together, and we bleed together.
My husband and I decided to bring our children up in a country setting. We wanted them to go to good schools and live in a quiet, peaceful neighborhood.
As a family, we had a normal, quote what normal is, but we had a very, structured, healthy, happy, did a lot of family things together, camping.
My mom raised, 3 girls by herself, worked at nights, and went to school during the day, try to make ends meet.
My son played football and baseball. He was a good student, very polite, always wanted to lend a helping hand to somebody.
My poor oldest sister was our permanent babysitter, Friday, Saturday nights, whenever my mom was working. So, yeah, she would have parties.
A good definition of addiction is impaired control over a reward-seeking behavior from which harm ensues. We repeat things we enjoy that give us this sense of reward and reinforcement. Drugs are particularly good at doing that because they provide a very concentrated form of enjoyment, right? So it's unlike our normal levels of reinforcers that we get in the real world, just with our social interactions and other things that we like to do.
Around his senior year, I did notice that there were times that he experimented with, underage drinking, which I was not happy about.
And, a lot of our friends would, like, oh, if you get me another beer, like, I'll give you the rest of this, or if you do this, I'll give you a cigarette.
There are mainly 4 reasons why people use a drug: to feel good, to feel better, to do better, or because other people are doing it. So typically what happens initially is they do it because other people are doing it. Most drug use occurs initially in a peer group. So you meet some friends, they're sampling, experimenting with different drugs. You might try it. For certain people, they may get a really profound experience from that drug, and they think, I really like that, I'm going to try it again.
As soon as I picked up that first drink at 12, I'd say, that was it. I drank alcoholically. I drank till I blacked out, passed out, throwing up, getting carried home from parties, not remembering what I did.
Got involved, I think I started recognizing when he was about 15 or 16. I think he was smoking pot, drinking a little bit. I didn't accept it, and I did address the issue, but I said, well, he's just going through a phase in his life. He's experimenting with things, and he'll be all right.
When we discovered my son had smoked pot like every other parent in town, we were not happy about it. We did what any other family would do. We would ground him or, talk to him about drugs and alcohol. We warned him about cocaine use, about ecstasy, which was big around that time. And we were nervous like any other parent, about this, but at the same time, he had a car and he would go out, but he'd come home when he was supposed to, and we had our eyes wide open on those things.
I had a conversation once with a heroin addict that I knew pretty well from dealing with him in different criminal cases, and I asked him, how did you get hooked on heroin? And he said, well, I had this drug deal that was selling me marijuana, maybe I did a little cocaine now and then. One day he handed me this stuff, I didn't know what it was, and he goes, here, try this. So he tried it, he sniffed it, and he goes, wow, that's pretty good. How long does the high last? And the drug dealer laughed at him and goes, the rest of your life.
In 1996, OxyContin came on the market. It wasn't a new drug. It had been around for years in the forms of Percocet and Percodan. Its generic name is oxycodone. It was synthesized first in 1906. But what the drug company did in 1996 was took the oxycodone and concentrated it, and they made it into tablets of 10 milligrams, 20 milligrams, 40 milligrams, 80 milligrams, and even 160 milligrams.
Any kind of marked change in behavior that will make you feel a bit suspicious. So for a parent, it may be that your son or daughter is now hanging around, we've got new friends that you haven't met before, that they never come around the house, out later than before, there are changes in it. They may become more irritable, more moody. Now, of course, these are not specific to drugs, but they may be a sign, okay, that there may be drug use going on.
I got suspended from school. I was always, throughout high school, getting called to, the principal's office for detention, getting in trouble in school, skipping class, cutting class, falling asleep in class. And a lot of the teachers would send me to the nurse and say, you smell like alcohol, marijuana, you need to go to the nurse. I got sent home a lot because of that.
The most noticeable thing for us was, the work ethic, not having any ambition, and staying up all night and then sleeping all day. Suddenly, things just changed.
I'd say 20, 21, 22, he was partying a lot, couldn't hold a job, worked. Every time he got hired by somebody, they'd say he was a great worker, but he would go through periods that he wouldn't show up and he'd lose his job.
Alcohol and nicotine and marijuana, opiates, these all have different specific effects, but they also have a kind of a common pathway in the brain. That's the dopamine system. So that's usually the chemical that makes us feel pleasure, makes us feel good. Part of the answer to why opiates in particular seem to quickly get people hooked is maybe two reasons. One is the specific effect to these opiate receptors, because it's an opiate, and we have these receptors in the brain that helps kill pain, so it kills that and has an analgesic effect, but it also produces this intense euphoria that increases the release of dopamine at a high level. Now, this is because when people use that particular substance, they're not using it typically at the prescribed dose for a therapeutic effect for which it's intended, but they're using it at double or triple or quadruple the dose, right? So in other words, they misuse it.
First year it was on the market, the sales weren't phenomenal because they were mainly marketing to oncologists and hospice patients, but they increased their sales force and started marketing to, to a broader base of physicians. So the sales started to take off in 1998 or so.
Specific to opiates is this constriction of the pupils, fatigue, overly tired, the opposite kind of being hyperactive on the other side when they're in withdrawal from stopping taking a drug, having sleeping difficulties and mood dysregulation, mood ups and downs more frequent. So some of those could be some signs that they may be misusing a drug in the beginning. Later on, it's much more obvious.
I noticed a lot of his friends that he used to always be with were gone, and he had been complaining about stomach pain. I noticed his skin was really breaking out, and he got sort of a funny, look, sort of a clammy look to his skin. He was losing weight. It just, if I can look back at it now, it's almost like he was dwindling away.
He got arrested for breaking into cars. There was some few things missing in the house, and I'd say, oh, it's gone.
I'll be at the store with my wife and I can see someone be like, that person's on something. A lot of times it's in their eyes. The pupils are usually pinpointed. Their speech might be slurred. And then a lot of times they'll be sweating, or their face will be sunken in, maybe, yellow. A lot of times they're not well kept because they're more concerned about drugs and their personal hygiene. So a lot of different things you'll look for.
I brought him to a crisis center because I thought maybe he was depressed. And, within minutes, he came out with a prescription for lithium and sleeping pills, and we were told he had bipolar. So I felt relief, and I thought this medication was going to help him.
So the 80 milligram tablet was equivalent to 16 Percocet tablets. So one person would take 1 OxyContin 80 milligrams instead of 16 Percocet tablets. Right away, since I was working at the hospitals, I kind of saw that as a potential problem, just that since oxycodone at high doses can cause respiratory depression and death, that if somebody accidentally got a hold of an 80 milligram tablet, it could be a fatal consequence, especially kids or people that haven't taken narcotics. I didn't foresee the problem that it would increase drug addiction.
There was a day where he was sitting in our living room on the couch and I was painting, you know, the walls. And I said something to him that required an answer, and he didn't answer me. So I turned around and I looked at him, and he was sitting on the couch, and his chin was just down on his chest, and he looked like he was unconscious. So I walked over to him and I nudged him, and his head came up and his eyes completely rolled back in his head, and that's when I knew something's really wrong with him. He's on some type of drug.
I know I went through a denial period where, you know, no, not my kid's not involved in heavy drugs. He's drinking and he's a little bit, and he's smoking marijuana, and it's something that won't kill him, and he can't be doing cocaine or heroin or...
LSD was very common. I'd say at age 17 or 16, cocaine came into play, and it just went hand in hand with the alcohol.
By then, he was already shooting heroin. He was already pretty much in the throes of addiction.
The term opiates describes drugs that are derived from opium or that work similar to opium. The main drug in the class is morphine. Oxycodone is very, very similar to morphine, so they have a lot of legitimate use out there for cancer pain and for other types of pain. The problem arises when they use for non-medical purposes, when people use it to get high and or when they mix it with other drugs. The problem with it too is that they become addicted, and the addiction comes from that the body craves the drug or needs the drug, because when they stop taking it, they get very sick with it, nauseous, or they get withdrawal symptoms. So people want the drug so that they feel better or get back to normal.
I think here in Weymouth that there was a problem with opiates early on in the 2000s, and it's been a growing problem ever since. It's all over the entire South Shore. It's in Massachusetts, period. Almost everyone I talk to either has a family member, a friend, or someone that they know who has a problem with an opiate addiction.
Like one night, me and my 2 girlfriends are sitting there, and we're like, let's just get out of here. I'm like, all right. I had like $30 that my Grammy probably gave me, and I packed a bag and we took off in a Honda Prelude and drove cross country. We ended up in San Diego. At age 17, I ended up homeless on Ocean Beach, California. Tijuana was about a 15-minute drive. You could really buy anything in Tijuana, legally. And I was using a lot of crystal meth. That's when I started, you know, getting into the opiates, the Percocets.
Young people have the misconception that prescription drugs are safer than other drugs, you know, because they're coming from a pharmacy and doctors write prescriptions for it, so it must be safe. But in reality, they're probably more dangerous than some other street drugs because they are so pure and they are so concentrated.
He had gone to a party. He had just turned around 19. And at that party, there was, of course, underage drinking. A mirror was passed around. And he describes this today as, you know, he didn't even think. Everybody was trying it. The mirror went around and he snorted something on that mirror. Not asking what it was, not really knowing what it was, it just was passed around. As he describes it, the very next day he needed more of that. It turns out it was crushed up OxyContin.
The addiction can start in as little as a week, I've heard. It's usually not a problem for people who are taking it for legitimate pain. Because they take it for the pain, and when the pain's gone, they stop taking it. And it's usually not a problem in people who are taking it for cancer pain, because they're taking it for a specific type of pain. They're not looking to abuse it, and they take it continuously. The problem arises when for people who are trying to get that high they got from the first time they took it. They probably never get that high again, but they're always chasing that high. But then they get addicted, and then now they're just taking the drugs so they don't feel sick. I think most physicians might say that they have 1 or 2 patients they just, you know, they struggle with, that they just can't control their pain or they can't control their addiction.
He was very adamant about getting help, and then we went to his primary care physician initially, and they went through some counseling, and we did that.
I came back because I had court cases pending in New Hampshire and Rhode Island, and my dad got me into one of the best union building trades in Boston. And I became an apprentice, and I started working full-time in construction. So we had people men from all over the country come into these jobs to work. And there was just such different drugs that they were bringing. Fentanyl, I started getting into, a different type of heroin, OCs, just a lot of drugs on this job, and God forbid the lives that were lost on that job, because there was plenty of them.
I thought we were a happy family, sociable, always supported him throughout all his years of sports, and always went to, PTA meetings if there was a meeting with a teacher. And so the first feeling I had was, what did we do wrong? What did we do? What did we do to him? How did this happen? And so that's where the shame and the guilt came in, trying to figure out what we did and blaming ourselves immediately. And the shame part is even almost worse because, once this happens in your family, word gets around. Other people start to find out, and there's judgment. There's judgment out there.
Us as a family, it became very disruptive in my family. It wasn't a healthy environment because this person that we knew was our son, who we still loved, was not the same person.
As people progress into an addictive syndrome, it becomes the most important thing in their day, to the exclusion of all other reinforcers in their lives, to their social relationships, their friends, their family, their work, their health, and eventually they would die.
I ran into a woman in a little store in town that I used to see at the football field all the time. I mean, we would sit together, we'd talk, and I knew the day that I ran into her and she completely turned her back on me and didn't want to speak to me, that we were now being looked at as probably the bad family in town.
Did I get mad? Yeah, I used to get mad. Of course I got mad at him. When I get mad when he stole money, and yeah, because it wasn't a good thing. Did I throw him out at times? Yeah. Did I take him back? I always took him back. Did I give him money? Yeah, because I kept on saying, well, if I give him money, he'll get a job, or he'll do this and get better.
I bought a 2-bedroom, 2-bath condo right here, right down the street in South Weymouth. I'm a construction worker. I did a lot of work on it. And within a month, it was a shooting gallery. It was a crack house. It was just unlivable.
You also deal with losing people that you cared about that don't understand. Sometimes that can even be family members. They might automatically blame the family, that it's something the family must have done wrong, that this is how, they weren't raising their children right. And there's nothing worse than that, because you're already down as low as you can get. That's how I felt. I felt like I couldn't fall any further. And I started to isolate. I didn't want to go anywhere in town. If I food shopped, I went out of town. I didn't want to run into people.
It was disgusting. I was like walking over people that are like in a nod or sleeping as I'm going to work. And then I was making all this other money from renting my spare bedroom to what we call travelers, the men from out of state. And I was making other money from my friends that, were copping drugs off the dealer that was always at my house. And, no one was allowed. Like, when that door knocked, like, what do you want? What do you got? What are you giving me to come in my home? Like, and still I was dope sick, and still that condo went into foreclosure, and still eventually I had no electricity in that condo.
He had a union job And he made very good money, he worked very hard. He lost that job because of his addiction. He had a condo. He owned a one-bedroom condo he was paying a mortgage on. He lost that because of his disease. He had a car, nice car. He lost that because of his disease. He had a beautiful girlfriend who was a sweetheart. He lost her because of his disease.
And the shame and the guilt starts to go on to the younger kids, which is very dangerous for them at their age. For my kids, it was at their ages. My daughter was in her first year of high school, so that was very difficult for her because people were talking, oh, your brother's a junkie and blah, 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 and you know, things would happen in town, people would find out about it. And my youngest was young enough that his friends really didn't know about it, but I think their parents did. So you knew sometimes when he wasn't invited somewhere that it might be because they feel a fear that maybe I was a bad parent, if they didn't know me. So it's not only having to learn what you need to do to try to help your son or daughter, it's very hard to get through every day when you don't have really a lot of support out there from other people that don't understand. And they can't understand unless it happens to them.
When I began my administration, I knew I was going to be dealing with a lot of finance problems. But what ended up happening was I was getting a lot of visits, actual visits in my office, from parents, grandparents, sisters and brothers of addicted young people. And when I say addicted, what I was very confused about, they were talking a lot about heroin. And although I certainly wasn't so naive to think that there was no heroin in Weymouth, I didn't think that it was the popular drug by any means.
People just don't go right to heroin. It's a slow progression, and it can start off with those painkillers, the Percocet, the Vicodin, the Oxycontin, and then it moves on. And not everyone's, taking it just for recreation, but people are taking it medically and still becoming addicted. And if they're not getting a prescription any longer from their doctor, they're going to find it other ways.
Opiates were a stepping stone to cheaper heroin. The heroin was so pure that you could inhale it and snort it, and then you wouldn't have to inject it.
If I was a drug addict, I could leave here and probably get heroin in 5 or 10 minutes. Unfortunately, it's probably easier for kids to get than for them to get alcohol from a package store, unfortunately. And when we catch a drug user using heroin, we usually debrief them, we talk to them, try to get to the bottom of what caused their problem. And a lot of times we find that a drug dealer will give out free samples of heroin to young kids. So they'll give out a free sample that might have cost them a few bucks, and knowing that he had them hooked and he'd be taking his money for the next, for 10, 20 years.
From what I've heard, it's the cost. Because the heroin's so much cheaper than in the prescription drugs. It just, when you need to take more and more of it, your body needs more and more. You might need 80 milligrams or 200 milligrams a day of oxycodone, and so that just gets very expensive. Your
typical OxyContin pill is roughly $1 a milligram, so if you have an 80 milligram OxyContin, it's roughly $80. It may be less if you buy in bulk. And generally a 30 milligram Percocet, which is being pretty heavily abused now, is roughly $30 a pill. And you have people using 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 OxyContin pills a day times roughly $80. It's an expensive, bad habit.
I was taking an extreme amount of OCs. I was doing about 12 80s a day. And like I said, I'm a manipulator. So I found the drug dealer on the job, and and whatever, he became my boyfriend, of course. At that point I started buying heroin, and yeah, I was snorting it at first. It didn't occur to me at the time, like, oh, I'll never use a needle, I'll never do that. Like, maybe every now and again it would occur to me, but it didn't take much time before I did.
And this is where people get into real problems then, not just with overdosing, because you don't know what you're going to get, with heroin on the street, but you also have the risk of transmitting other diseases. There's risk of HIV transmission, hepatitis C transmission through needle use.
It wasn't like I could just do one shot and it would last me a few hours, and do another one, it would last me a few hours. Like if I took a nap for an hour, that was it. I was dead dope sick. My boyfriend, my ex-boyfriend, he'd hit me up while I was sleeping, and I'd wake up, and so I wouldn't be dope sick, and I wouldn't do that, and I wouldn't freak out and start throwing things and throwing up and just being an impulsive pig with all the heroin that we had.
Well, people often relapse because of this. There's kind of a biological deprivation going on in the brain. So in other words, your brain is not releasing, or you're not sensing that same level that you would normally feel, that normal people feel, and maybe if you're a recovering addict, you don't feel that same level you used to feel before you started using drugs.
I'll never forget the first detox, thinking, okay, I've got this under control. He's going to be okay now. Out in 4 days, relapse, right back to square one. And that went on and on and on and on.
We sent him to probably 2 or 3 different private rehabs. One of the ones was when he was down in Florida, and he was doing good for about 4 to 5 months, and then he ended up going out and using down there, so they threw him out.
And then I'd have to get back on the phone. And sometimes, and especially back then, it would take 3 or 4 days to get a bed.
It's a bit like we know how to alleviate thirst by drinking a glass of water when you're really thirsty. The addict, recovering person who is in this initial phase of recovery, they feel that kind of sense of thirst, if you like, but it's coming from the dopamine system. And so they remember very well what will alleviate that. And so that's why they're susceptible to relapse, because they know how to relieve those cravings is by taking that drug.
You have to be dirty to go into a rehab. You can't be clean. So he would have to go and get drugs so he could urinate in the sample jar to get admitted to the rehab.
You'd finally get a bed. He'd go back in. You'd get a couple of days to feel anxiety again about when he's coming back out, because it was never enough time. Then he'd come out and he'd relapse. The entire family just completely suffers with each relapse. And I started to feel like I was a failure, like it was something I wasn't doing, when what I should have been realizing is he wasn't getting enough treatment. There wasn't enough time for treatment.
So these kind of 3 ways to relapse is kind of cue-induced relapse, stress-induced relapse, and drug-induced relapse. Cues, conditioned cues in the environment. You might associate drug use with certain places, with certain friends, certain parts of the city, the park, whatever it is, wherever you used to do drugs. Those become conditioned cues, right, associated with the drug use. Stress can become a conditioned cue to alleviate stress. So when people feel stressed or blue, down, anxious, they also know, they've learned that the drug will alleviate some of those conditions. So those become conditioned cues. Of course, even a small dose of the drug can become a conditioned cue for relapse. It may serve as a kind of a priming dose that then leads to a full-blown relapse. So this often happens when people say, well, I'm not going to use a lot, I'm just going to use a little bit. I'm just going to use every now and then. But what happens is, once they take a little bit of the substance, that kind of activates the brain, and then they find themselves using more and more. So it's like a priming dose.
Part of that addiction, unfortunately, it becomes a full-time job for them to feel normal. Because once they're addicted to this drug, they have to do things to make sure they always have the drug, which means stealing from family members, younger kids. I'll never forget my youngest son, coming to me and saying all his video games were gone.
They become very proficient at playing mind games with you. And they could tell you that they need money for gas. They could tell you they need money because they owe on a bill. They could tell it, but most of the time it's not going there.
Like one big one is, I owe the drug dealer $500. He's threatening to come and burn our house down. So we give them the $500.
He stole checks from us, thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars.
CDs, jewelry, tools. They'll go to the local pawn shops and just pawn anything.
And I remember I had a balcony and I took an extension cord and wrapped it up and stole the man's outdoor electricity so I could have electricity in my house.
I used to sleep in my wallet because he would steal from us. He didn't tell me that he lost his license, and he slammed into a pole with my wife's car, and fortunately no one was hurt, and he was drinking and drugging.
Or, I need gas in my car, can I put $20 in the car? We might think it's safe to give him the credit card to put $20 on it, yet he's not putting gas in his car, he's putting it in the drug dealer's car, and the drug dealer's giving him the heroin.
He filled out charge card forms, and he lied that he had a job, and it was his fault, and he ran up 10 grand on one of them. He didn't even have a job. And another one, he ran up 8 grand. And at the beginning, I was trying to help him with that, and then I said, well, that's his problem. I can't deal with that. And when he was losing his condo, I tried to help him.
It was just real bad. Real bad. There was a few overdoses in the house. The police were definitely watching the house.
You know, so you're losing everything. You're losing your child. You're losing your sense of security in your own home. You're trying to be there for your younger children, and the younger children see you cry all the time. You might go to their sporting events and not really pay attention like you used to, because on your mind the entire time is, my son or daughter going to die today? Is today going to be the day I get the call? Because they'll go missing.
He would punch the door, put cracks in the door, punch his wall, put holes in the wall. He ended up that he had hepatitis, and I was looking in his closet one day for a sweater to wear, and there was a used needle in there, and I stuck myself with the needle. I got tested. Fortunately, I didn't get infected with the disease, but anything is possible.
It got really bad. It got really, really bad. I got really, really bad. To the point, like I said, no matter how much money I made, I was still dope sick.
But one of the things I noticed also statewide is that the number of pharmacy robberies was starting to increase dramatically. In 1997, I believe there was no pharmacy robberies. By 1999, it had escalated to well over 100. So from 0 to 100 almost instantaneously, and in every single case, OxyContin was what the criminals were looking for.
Generally, a heroin addict or an OxyContin addict will do whatever they have to do to get their next hit. It starts off, they'll steal from their family, from their own parents. They might break into a family member or someone they know's house, and it gets to a point where some may prostitute, females in particular. Some graduate to bank robberies, convenience store robberies, breaking and entering into cars. If I had to guess, I would say 85% of the crimes that my regular detectives investigate have something to do with drug or alcohol abuse. There's no doubt in my mind.
He got arrested numerous times. He got arrested for drinking and driving and possession of cocaine, possession of a hypodermic needle, possession of heroin, I believe he was, because he was in and out of prison. Initially, I used to bail him out all the time, and I felt that that wasn't working, so I used to say, well, you made this mistake, you stay in there. We
have some pretty well-trained narcotics detectives that they see stuff that normal people wouldn't see in a parking lot or activity. We have to follow the Constitution. We can't just kick people's door in and pull people over and rip their car apart. We have to go by the rules, and they don't. So our job's a little difficult, but on the same token, they might get away with selling drugs 1,000 times, and all we have to do is catch them once.
You know, the funny thing about it is, like I said, like my dope dealer, was always at my house. I never actually went out and, the word they use is cop drugs. Like I either went to work to get it or they came to my house. My friend I was with was like, please, can you stop? We got set up. He ran out of the car, got whatever he got. It was a small, small amount. And as we're pulling out, the dealer's in front of us. He takes a right, we take a left. Now we're going on the Braintree Rotary, and like 5 SUVs come, and like I almost hit the barrier. I remember they had guns to my head. There was a lot of stolen property in the car. You know, I didn't do the B&E, like, I just didn't do it, you know, but it wasn't even my truck. But I got charged with all that.
I would say most addicts don't even know their dealer's real name. The dealers that come out from Boston will not be heroin users. They won't touch the stuff. But they'll deliver a certain amount to someone, maybe a heroin addict in Weymouth, say they'll give them 20 bags, and that heroin addict becomes a heroin dealer because they'll sell 18 of the bags to pay for their 2 bags. So it's a distribution network, but at the start, when it's being brought to Weymouth, those people don't use heroin because they know better, and they know that if they get addicted to the stuff, they're going to be using their own profits.
As far as fear, yeah, did I fear? Yeah, because I'll tell you, one night I brought him in to buy drugs, and he was going to go to a rehab, and like I said, I'm not proud of what I did, but I felt at that time I wanted to get him into a rehab, and he was gonna get better this time of all, you know, numerous times this time is gonna work. And I was sitting in a parking lot, and I could see the transaction going on between the guy across the street and walking down the street, another guy watching, and they left one guy behind to watch me because they didn't know who I was, and he bent over to get something out of his car, and he had a pistol.
The problem I'm in now is there seems to be a pipeline from Florida of people going back and forth and getting prescriptions for OxyContin in Florida and bringing them back here to sell on the street. There'll be groups of a dozen people working for one particular drug dealer, and they'll send them down back and forth to Florida once every 2 weeks, and they go to these pain clinics in Florida that are like convenience stores up here, and they tell the doctor they have a back problem. Next thing you know, they're leaving with a prescription, and it's getting piped back up to Massachusetts.
I used to sleep with a baseball bat next to my bed because I feared that there was someone who was that he knew was going to come into my house, because I know there was at times that he owed money and couldn't pay it.
Usually a drug deal is, when I first started investigating drugs, they were meeting in convenience store parking lots, department store parking lots, supermarket parking lots where it's busy, and it would be a car pulling up to a car, and a quick one hand passes money and the other hand passes the drugs, and they're gone. Lately, they've changed it up to where they'll meet in a quiet neighborhood, and the person will pull up, and it'll be a quiet little dead end, and a neighbor will call and be like, you know, in the last 4 days, I've seen the same car meeting someone, and that's how we pick up on it. But they continue to come up with more and more creative ways to avoid us, and we just have to keep up with it.
I guess I could say that I hit a bottom. My marriage started to fail, because another thing that happened was I wanted to fix him. I wanted to just fix him. My husband was able to look at it in another way, that we had no control really over this, that all we could do was at one point protect ourselves from the addiction, because we were becoming victims, I guess you could say, of his addiction, not of him, because he was under control. This drug had such control over him that our son was gone for a long time. It wasn't him anymore. He was being driven by, like I can describe it as like a monster force that just took him away.
I think it's underappreciated how much the loved ones of the individual who's addicted suffer. They suffer greatly because they are literally worried sick about the potential. It's so unpredictable. That's the other thing. You don't know when you're going to get a call. In the middle of the night, your son or daughter's in the hospital, your loved one's in the hospital, or in the police custody. It's so unpredictable and so nerve-wracking that people are living their lives on a knife edge. They themselves can't sleep.
So you're constantly trying to find a way to get rid of that monster. For my husband, it was the tough love approach. You know, okay, so you're not going to agree with this, you're not going to do this, then you need to go. I, on the other hand, was enabling everything. I didn't know it at the time, but I wanted to fix things. So I'd start covering up and not telling my husband if he took something, or, you know, if an incident happened, I'd be afraid to tell my husband because I didn't want him to leave. I wanted to take him and put him in a little bubble and just fix him. They have to suffer many consequences before they'll have the desire to change. As the parent, I had to suffer many consequences for my own decisions, because the more I did for him that he should have been doing for himself, the worse he got. The way I looked at it is I was in such crisis, there was no way I was going to heal until I had some sort of education on what he was suffering from. Because if he had diabetes, I would want to learn about the diabetes. If he had cancer, I would want to learn about the cancer. I would want to know what are the signs and symptoms I need to look for. What kind of medication should he be using?
My PO came knocking on my door one day at the condo, like, what are you doing? You're coming up dirty left and right, like, what is going on? And she's like, I need to surrender you. So she gave me a surrender hearing for me to get into a halfway house program.
And then after that, going to detoxes and being turned away because there's no beds, or not being able to afford something, or insurance. And a lot of these kids don't have insurance because part of the symptom of their addiction is they can't work because their full-time job is their next fix because they're a prisoner of that addiction. So a family suffers terribly, just terribly.
So at high doses, what happens is you get respiratory depression, and that you basically stop breathing. So people that aren't used to taking lots of narcotics, if they just start taking them all of a sudden, can die of respiratory depression. So that's what we see, is that we see young people in their 20s are found dead, and it's because of usually mixing the narcotics, taking too much of it, and mixing them with alcohol and other drugs.
It's such a dangerous thing for young people, because young people are not aware. They don't realize when they've taken too much, and if they're mixing with alcohol as well, then there can be a deadly combination.
People wouldn't necessarily think taking one of anything could hurt them, but in the case of if it's a highly concentrated or a high milligram strength tablet, that one tablet could be difference between life and death.
He was screaming upstairs that he couldn't breathe and he didn't know what was the matter. He was going, and of course pandemonium sets in, and my wife called for an ambulance, and he was ODing. He was up in his bedroom, and the EMTs come up and they, stabilized him.
Usually someone that's overdosing, they'll look, at first they'll look really intoxicated, really tired, and then they'll end up unconscious. Basically, they'll look as if they're almost dead. And sometimes we'll get to a scene of an overdose and think the person may be dead, and then they'll be revived with Narcan by the paramedics.
Nasal Narcan, it doesn't treat the addiction, but it can prevent somebody from dying from a narcotic overdose, because it blocks the narcotics respiratory depression effect so that they can stop breathing again. It's very short-lived. You still need to go to the hospital or give another Narcan dose in an hour or so. So it's one tool to maybe save the addict's life, to give them a chance to get to treatment. It doesn't treat the addiction.
I started to literally, and I've heard this from other parents, started thinking about how am I going to afford his funeral? Where are we going to bury him? I started calling family members and letting them know, you know, he's not doing well, he's very ill. You know, I can't seem to reach him.
Got surrendered again by probation, and the PO just said, section her for 30 days. And back then there wasn't these programs called WOTC or MATC. You know, I went to Framingham.
You could have a bad batch of heroin where it's twice as strong as it usually is. It's not like a regulated thing where you know how many calories are in your candy bar or something. You're getting some criminal somewhere is cutting it with whatever they decide to cut it with, and however strong or weak they decide to make it. So you don't know how strong or how weak your heroin is. So you could get a strong bag of heroin and use it, and it's way too much for you.
And the second time he OD'd, he woke me up screaming that he couldn't breathe. Then he was on the floor holding his heart, screaming, and my wife come down, and again we called for the ambulance, and fortunately they revived him and they took him to the hospital, and I went up to the hospital, and the nurse told him, she explained to him that his heart is a muscle, and if you don't stop doing this, you keep on stretching your muscle and harming your muscle that will never heal. You are going to kill yourself one of these times.
So now I just waited in Framingham for a bed. Just wanted to get out of there at this point. You know, I still didn't have the willingness to get sober. I just wanted to get out of jail. You know, for the first time in my life, I was scared.
June 30th of 2010, I got a knock on the door, and it was 2 state police, not local police, who came to my house to tell me that my son had passed. They found my son's car on a side street, and he walked away from the car, and he went into someone's garage that he didn't even know. He had taken his sneakers off, and he injected himself, and he OD'd, and the gentleman who lived in the house found him the next morning when he went to go take his rubbish out. So that's how he passed. He overdosed from a disease that caused him his life. And it's a pretty sorry state of affairs when you have to die in someone's garage.
You can think about the recovery phase as acute withdrawal, post-acute withdrawal, and then early recovery. So acute withdrawal is just this metabolic stabilization. They may, you know, with opiates, you may get very tired, you may feel very sick, you might have diarrhea, which are the opposite of the effects of the acute effects of the drug. Now that typically lasts no more than a few days, or a week, 10 days, something like that. After that, so you're kind of stable again, and most people go into a hospital maybe to go through that phase if you're alcohol dependent or drug dependent.
So they probated me to a halfway house, very strict halfway house. And again, I wanted nothing to do with sobriety, so I didn't accept any of their suggestions. I would go to meetings, so unapproachable.
I was at work one day, and I was, you know, my son at the time was incarcerated. And I was really, you know, upset about that and just sort of struggling through every day. And a coworker came up to me and handed me a flyer. And it said what parents need to know. And it was a warning about OxyContin and heroin. And it was being run by Bill Keating, the district attorney for Norfolk County. So I called the number, and I spoke to somebody in Bill Keating's office, and I gave her my phone number and everything, and then a few minutes later, Bill Keating called me. So he said, would you like to get up and say a few words at this forum? And I said, yeah, maybe. I said, I'll come, and we'll see what happens. Well, I got there, and I ended up getting up on the stage, and I cried in front of, like, I don't know, there was probably about 200 people there.
It's called the jumping off point that they talk about in the big book. You do not want to get high anymore, but you definitely don't want to be removed from drugs and alcohol and feel the way you're feeling. Because it's not drugs and alcohol that's my problem, it's my solution. It's the way I feel. It's a disease that I feel, that I have a hole in the soul where I use drugs and alcohol to fill that. Okay, now once you take my solution away, I'm still stuck with Jamie. And Jamie's the problem. So I was more nuts than when I was getting high. You know what I mean? Removed from drugs for 10 months, and I was crazier.
When people stop and they've gone through this acute withdrawal phase, there's a period of time where they have concentration difficulties, mood dysregulation as the brain is adjusting or throwing these chemicals around as it's trying to get back and stabilize again. Fatigue, they can feel very tired, or they can feel very anxious. Is another symptom early on in this post-acute withdrawal. They might find it difficult to sleep, which is a big problem early on. They just can't relax and sleep. So all of these, of course, make it very challenging for people to stay stopped, right? Then, when you couple that with all these conditioned cues in the environment, these people, places, and things, it makes it very difficult for people to get through this initial phase, which is the hardest, this first 3 to 6 months. Very, very difficult. That's when most people will return to drug use, especially in that first 3-month period.
Afterwards, a reporter came up to me, and he asked me if he could write about what I said. And I said, sure. And he asked me for my email address, and I had already had an email address that was Learn to Cope 2001, because when I was at home, I'd constantly be researching heroin and OxyContin addiction. And, I picked that Yahoo address because I wanted to be anonymous. I said to him, I would love to hear from other parents, because I know there's tons of them out there. I know they're in my area. And, if you could put that in there, I would love to, have some other parents to talk to through email. I got about 90-something emails in just a couple of days from all over the South Shore.
10 months sober, I voluntarily, willingly, packed my bags from that halfway house, and I went in front of the judge. I was still in drug court. She's like, a rule's a rule. Like, you violated probation. You left our house. So at 10 months sober, I was sitting in jail, prison once again. I'm like, what's wrong with me? Like, I wanted to do nothing. Like, I just wanted to go there and just kind of like, the best word I can describe is like marinate. Like, do nothing. Not make my bed. Not get up for breakfast. Not do this. Not go to their groups. I just didn't want to do anything.
The town of Weymouth is very, very fortunate to have our substance abuse coordinator, Lynn Frano, and I sort of coupled up with her to try to find out, what is this? What are the numbers? Where are the stats?
We're constantly assessing the community to look at what people are abusing, and we have one-on-one conversations with people in the community all the time. We also look at death certificates. We look at all sorts of records, hospitalizations, the school survey. And what we found was a huge rise in OxyContin use and with heroin use.
Now, I'm not a believer of imposing government into people's lives a lot, but my feeling of government, especially on a town and local level, is that the health and safety of your residents is paramount. I couldn't sit back and let this happen in my town, in our town, and not do something about it.
It turned into having really not much to support, to communicating with all these mothers and fathers that I didn't even know, and they all had the same story. My daughter tried OxyContin, now she's a heroin addict. My son died. My son committed a robbery. My daughter's in jail. And it was all, they tried OxyContin. And, you know, it was huge awakening for me. I had no idea how big this was until that article came out. So as I was communicating with these people, I'm like, well, let's just start meeting. Because I just all of a sudden felt better. Because here I am finally talking to people that knew how I felt, and I knew how they felt. I didn't feel like I was being judged. I felt like I could cry with them. I could talk to them. And all of a sudden, I just got this empowerment back. And the shame started to kind of lift away. The anxiety was lifting away.
My mom had become a very spiritual woman at this time through Al-Anon. She turned to me on the phone and she said to me, I don't get it. I don't understand why you'd leave that house to get help, to go back to prison, to do nothing. She's like, I don't understand. And for the first time in my life, I didn't have an answer. I mean, my whole life, I had answers for everything. Well, because of this, like, all lies, but I always had an answer for everything. Most alcoholics do. And I didn't have an answer. And it kind of frightened me. When she said, the only one that can help you is God. I highly advise you to go search and seek him out, even if you don't know who it is. I hit my knees that day in a jail cell, and like I didn't know who I was speaking to or who I was asking for help to, but I just asked for help. Asked for help, hit my knees, and just said, God, please, please help me. And I'll tell you, from that day forward, my life has gotten just better, better. I mean, yeah, trials and triumphs and relapse, but it's gotten better.
And I started letting people know we're going to start meeting. And the first meeting, there was probably about 25 people. So people started feeling like, wow, we can actually do something about, help do something about this and get the awareness out. Well, that first meeting grew so large that I needed a bigger room. We had to move to Stoughton because we got so big. And then we got too big for Stoughton. It was starting to become standing room only, these meetings. People were coming from South Boston, they were coming from Framingham, they were coming from Natick. Because in the meantime, I started to get very vocal publicly because I was starting to, people were hearing about this group. So I'd get calls from reporters or town officials or police chiefs wanting me to talk to schools. And you know, with the district attorney, I went around to different schools and venues, and it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. Then we had to move again over to Brockton, which today, that meeting, there's 100 people in that room on Monday nights.
My son had his closest friend who was at his service, who came up to me the day of my son's service and was crying, and I was crying, and he asked me, is there anything I can do for you, Mr. Farrell? And I looked at him, and he was a dead man walking. He was an addict for quite a few years. He was as white as a sheet of paper, drawn, physically drawn. And I said to him, you want to do something for me? And you say you're in there crying because Coley's dead? And for your mother? And for your wife? And for your daughter? Get yourself clean.
I did end up getting on the same page with my husband. And it was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do in my life. But I had to protect my younger children and our marriage. And we had to give him an ultimatum that you either go to treatment or you leave. It's going to be your choice. And he left. So, you know, then you're thinking, is he going to die tonight? And if he does die tonight, am I going to blame myself forever? You just have no control whatsoever over this.
Well, Section 35 is called Section 35 because it is Section 35 in the Massachusetts general laws. What that refers to is involuntary commitment for someone with an alcohol or drug-related problem. Loved ones, sometimes they feel it's necessary to involuntarily commit them. And there is a procedure that you can follow through the court system by petitioning the court, and they can actually have that person put into treatment for a period of 30 days to get the help that they need.
So his mother, I believe, had him sectioned. He was gone for a month.
So I did end up going to the courts. It's not a pretty situation. They're brought there by, you know, they're picked up by the police in the home. They're brought in front of a judge. I proved to the judge that his life was definitely in danger. Thankfully, he believed me. And from there, after that 30 days, he went to another facility because our family stood strong and said, you need longer treatment. You can't come home, and you need to take care of this illness that you have. And at the same time, there's kids dying all around him. One of his friends actually passed away, and he was one of the ones that was there that night that they first tried that OxyContin. So the reality was really setting in, and I think that gave me the courage to do what I did.
What the evidence shows actually is that people, regardless of how they get into treatment, respond favorably to treatment. So even when people are mandated into treatment through, for example, a Section 35, those people tend to do as well, when you look at their follow-ups, as those who enter voluntarily. They may even do a little bit better.
I finally got stipulated to a halfway house that I knew I could graduate. I was still manipulating. I'm like, oh, I can graduate this house. It's an easy house. So by the time I left, I had 18 months sober. And for me, just for me, personally, this is just my story, I needed that. It took me 18 months to finally get it, to finally have that willingness, to finally be like, okay, sobriety is better. Like, okay, this isn't that bad. I can do this. And I started wanting to do this.
If they can get past that first 3 months, their chances of success are much higher. If you get past that first 6 months, higher still. But these what we call post-acute withdrawal phase symptoms can be very problematic, challenging to deal with, and that's why people need a lot of support early on. They need a lot of intensive support, ongoing support, especially in that first 3 to 6 months.
And I said, do you want to take a chance to his brother? And he says, what's that? I said, well, I tell you what, your brother owes some money to the registry. I'll loan him half, and you loan him half, and let's get his license back. And he said, if it wasn't for you, Farrell, I wouldn't do this, because he stole everything from me, and his friends have stole from my family, and everything. He says, we'll do it. I
moved out of Alston. That's where the house was, and I got my own place in Wollaston, and you know, jumped into a home group, took suggestions, jumped right into a home group, grabbed a woman sponsor, got active with the group, went on commitments with the group, jumped in the big book with the woman sponsor, because in that big book is the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. They wrote that book for one person to go through it with another person as you go through those steps. Like, that's the correct way and the way to, you know, recover from this disease.
Well, he went and got his license back, and then he went looking for a job. Every day he looked for a job. And I talked to him all the time, and I'd say, you gotta keep knocking, because something's gonna break. If you stay clean, something's gonna break.
So he really had nowhere else to turn other than I could hit the streets again and have nowhere to go and live the rest of my life as a drug addict, or I can try this thing and see if I can fix myself and see if I can find recovery.
You know, 4.5 years went by, and I stayed sober, happily sober. I started sponsoring girls, started working at this great adolescent halfway house in South Boston, started helping these young ladies. You know, I went back to work as a pipe fitter. Things were looking good.
He found a job, I'd say about 6 weeks ago. He's working every day. He is one of the best workers they told me they had. He's doing so good where he's working, they want him to go to another location and to run the floor where he's worked out so well. And he's doing well because he has some self-worth and he feels good about himself.
The thing I realize now, though, is all of this had to happen. Every single horrific situation that happened to him and that happened to us had to happen. Because 1, we learned from each situation. 2, it made us all stronger. And 3, it gave us all desire. For our family, it gave us the desire to take our life back and to demand and to sort of fight the drug addiction that he had. Not him, but his addiction, by using a horribly painful, forceful way to put him in treatment and tell him to hit the road if you don't go to treatment. So either way, it's painful. For him, eventually he got sick and tired of being sick and tired, which eventually gave him the desire to try harder.
This is a journey that I will be recovering from for the rest of my life. It's a daily reprieve. I'll have to do it every single day. Some days are struggles. I'm not gonna lie, some days you can struggle, really struggle. And I'm not talking about, you know, struggle like I'm gonna get high, just like struggle. Like, you know, how does that person do that yet I can't? You know, just simple things.
He called me the first week that he got a paycheck, and he said, "Are you gonna be home, Mr. Farrell?" And I says, "Why, what's up?" He said, "I wanna come by and I wanna pay you some of that money that you lent me." So that tells me he's on the right track.
My son's doing very, very well today. He's a private citizen. He's a taxpayer. He's got a beautiful little family of his own now. He's got a nice home. He's got a good job. And I have to tell you, he's one of the strongest people I've ever known.
He has some self-worth, and he's a success story. He's a success story because he did it. No one else did it. He did it, and he had a chance. And that's what some of them need. They may not be successful the first time around, but they need a chance, and they gotta feel good about themselves.
How do I know it's better? I'm aware of what I do. I don't have blackouts. I don't have my extension cord hooked up to the upstairs neighbor's electric outlet. I pay my bills to the best of my ability. I actually talk to my family. I show up for my nieces and my nephews. I show up for birthdays, Christmases, Easter. I'm available today. I wasn't before.
There is no miracle pill out there, and there's no that you can just take the pill and all of a sudden your addiction is gone. Most of the time, this is a lifelong process. Everybody's different. It takes rehab. It takes sometimes multiple rehabs in years. A long process. Works best with support from families, friends. But there are tools out there, whether it's methadone or buprenorphine or 12-step programs such as AA. And there's also other parents groups out there such as Learn to Cope.
You just can't target kids. Prevention takes everyone in the community. So the more educated everyone is, the more successful it's going to be.
Well, prevention, as they say, an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. Prevention is the way to go. Of course, most parents and families think it's not going to happen to me. It's not going to happen to my family, so therefore we don't need to do anything about it. That's wrong. That's dead wrong, because All walks of life, all individuals are susceptible to drugs.
There's one thing you don't ever say to a family that's going through this, that your son or daughter is a really good kid and that they're very well educated and this wouldn't happen to them. That hurts. I only say that because it's happened to me so many times. I've been called by middle schools where prescription drugs have been brought into school from the house and shared with other kids that have had to be taken by ambulance to the hospital. No matter what we teach our kids, there is no guarantee that an adolescent isn't going to make a bad decision at some point. Smoking a cigarette or smoking pot, marijuana, or underage drinking, that's a bad decision. So if they can make that bad decision, don't think they can't go a little further and try something else out of a pill bottle, because that's where all our kids started, and it was always offered sometimes by family, friends of family, or someone else's parent, or someone taking it out of a medicine cabinet. So this could happen to your child, anyone's child. And if you walked into one of our meetings, you would think you were going to a PTA meeting. You see mothers and fathers that are joined together from good families and good marriages, might have a better career than you do, and it happened to their kids. So, you know, maybe the attitude too that, oh, they'll get through it, they'll grow out of it. They won't grow out of Percocets and Oxycontins and Vicodins. They'll be held hostage by those. They might try pot and get through it, but don't you think that someone that might be selling marijuana might have a little something else they can offer along with it? So don't think it's okay if your son or daughter's smoking pot.
I was ashamed myself at the beginning, that I can remember saying to my wife, don't tell anybody that he's using heroin. Don't tell him that. But that was, I look back and that was wrong, because that was my son who I loved. And I should have been more open with it and said, he is doing heroin. I need help. Who do I go to? Who do I talk to? What friends do I talk to besides my family? Who do I reach out to? And these are things that you have to find out as a parent or as a person who is living with someone with this disease.
If you're allowing your child to get high in your home, that's called enablement. That's preventing them from going out, getting homeless, hitting rock bottom, having no hustle, now dope sick, and the only place they have to turn is detox.
And I guess what parents say a lot is, when you're a parent throughout their entire life, if they skin their knee, who's there to put the Band-Aid on it? Mom and dad. I've seen both sides. I've seen the mom as the enabler, and the dad is the one that can really look at it with a true sense. And I've seen it, the dad is the enabler, and the mom being able to look at the reality of the situation and how it should be handled.
I'm a drug addict. If I could shoot heroin and have not one consequence, I'd still be shooting heroin today. So what I'd recommend to parents that are allowing their children to get high in their homes is to go to the court, section them, say they're a harm to themselves, they're a harm to me. You gotta know where they're gonna be. Obviously, they're at your home. Come and get them, section them. When they call from the section, which they will, you say, I'm sorry, you cannot come back here. You need to go to a halfway house, a 6-month program, and we will then start to help you. And if they choose not to, I wouldn't let them back. Because it would just be a cycle, a vicious cycle. You're not helping them. You're basically helping them kill themselves.
Learn to cope now, today, is everything I didn't have. And over the course of the years, the past few years, I learned a lot about overdose prevention and the signs and symptoms of overdose, how to assess them, what are the risk factors. One of the highest risk factors is when they come out of detox or incarceration. And when I learned that, I actually got a little angry at first because I thought, why didn't anyone ever tell me that? I can't tell you how many detoxes I picked him up from, and not once did anyone ever tell me, you might want to watch for these signs and symptoms. If you see this, call 911. Or if he's home and you know that he's used and he goes to bed, that's dangerous. A lot of parents find their kids dead in the morning. No one ever educated me on that. So now we give that information out at every single meeting. We have a packet that tells them the signs and symptoms of opiate overdose, what works, what doesn't work. Calling 911 is your first move. Of course, most families do that anyway. But we also teach them how to rescue breathe while they're waiting for the ambulance, and how to simply just lie them on their side on the floor and open their airwaves by leaning their head on their elbow and having one arm up and a knee bent. Many people have saved their own kids' lives at home by getting them to breathe again. They've found them blue, not breathing. They have rescue breathed and put life back into their son or daughter while they're waiting for an ambulance.
Self-esteem problems. A lot of addicts think, they don't fit in, they're not good enough. They don't like themselves. They'd rather be like that person. Or a lot of them are followers. Like if that person's drinking, oh, I'll drink. You could watch out for signs like that, like who are they hanging out with? Like, I want to meet them. Do you know what I mean? I want to meet them. Who are they? Just be aware. Just be aware, cautious. Grades are huge. One of my favorite things to teach parents who their kids are not using opiates and hopefully never will, or any type of drug really, is we created this board, and it's a trifold board, and we call it the puzzle. And it's everything that you find in your house that you find and you think, what is this? And so the Q-tips, the Q-tip sticks, the cigarette butts, the bottle caps, those 4 things were all had to do with heroin use. But when you don't find them all at once, and you just find little things around, you don't know that.
That stuff actually parents should be looking for if they think there's a problem. Look in the trash. Don't be afraid to check your kids' drawers. Check definitely the trash for small corner bags from sandwich bags and brown residue, cotton swabs, alcohol wipes. Look for stuff like that. Maybe the orange cap from a hypodermic needle you might find under a bed, stuff people need to look for.
We need to talk to our young children about the dangers of prescription drugs, but we also need to lock up our prescription drugs. Drugs are coming from people's medicine cabinets. Less than 4% of the people start taking drugs, getting them from drug dealers. So what happens is that people will take medicine from either their parents or grandparents and then share it with friends. And I've heard of stories where, there's parties where they have a bowl of pills. If you have drugs that are either expired, that aren't used anymore, that they're either out of date, or you had a surgery 5 years ago and you have an extra 30 Percocet tablets sitting in your medicine cabinet, is let's get it out of the medicine cabinet. So along with the Weymouth Police Department and DPW, we encourage people to bring these down to our drug take-back days.
We've seen in the last 15 years a huge increase in the number of cases of overdose deaths from prescription medication, increased medication, more people entering treatment because of prescription medication. It's kind of like our #1 drug epidemic right now is prescription meds, the misuse, diversion of prescription meds. Now, part of the allure, I think, for young people who are the most susceptible are young adults, 18 to 25, that's where we've seen the biggest increase, is The allure is, well, they're safe because they're nicely wrapped up in this little pill, and they're in a bottle, and they're prescribed by physicians, etc.
Get educated, read the prevention materials, read the literature, know how to talk to your child, know what to say to your child. People think, oh, I don't need this, my kid doesn't take drugs, or my kid isn't drinking, or whatever. And hopefully you'll never need it. But it's too late once they've already started.
My mother grew up in the Depression like a lot of people my age. And she used to tell me when I was a kid, ever since I could reason, she used to say to me, no matter what happens in your life, no matter what it is, I don't want you to say 2 words. And those words, I quit. So I can honestly say that I never quit on my son. And we all get caught up in, including myself, in things that we think are important, but they're really not. And even myself, we have a tendency to dwell on things that are really not important. And I think if we can put things in perspective that are important, like helping these people, kids and people that are inflicted with this disease, that's important.
Evan Dorsey. Lenny Orlandello, Jr. Derek A. Newton. Dan Berardi. Victor Faria. Michael Rich. Coley Farrell. Linda Beliveau. David Keith. Tim M. Maureen Reese. Nick Akins. Ryan Thompson. Nicole Pezenti. Vinnie Sean Cassell. Chris Young. Mike Irving. Jay McKiff. Ryan McKiff. Corey Ambler. Tim Hutchinson.